The Kimmel Center for the Performing Arts is really honored to be partnering with WURD right now. It's an incredibly important and a milestone anniversary for them. With 15 years of being the progressive and proud voice, 15 years as Pennsylvania's only African-American owned radio station and one of the few in the country, 15 years of amplifying the African-American voice in Philadelphia and beyond, and 15 years of educating, uplifting, and inspiring listeners and realizing the dream of Mrs. Beverly and the late Dr. Walter Lomax. That deserves a very healthy round of applause. WURD Radio has also been an invaluable partner for us here at the Kimmel Center. Sara Lomax-Reese, the president and CEO of WURD, is on our board of directors and is a key visionary on our education committee. With Sara's help, we have bold plans for bringing arts education to the children of Philadelphia, moving from 10,000 to 100,000 kids in the next 5 years. Through these efforts, the Kimmel Center is able to realize its vision of transforming lives daily through the arts. But Sara has also helped us in formulating strategic partnerships and relationships that are exemplified tonight by helping us round out the panel discussion with DeRay Mckesson by bringing in Lorene Cary and Dr. Marc Lamont Hill and Uncle Bobbie's Coffee and Books. Diversity and inclusion are core to our mission here at the Kimmel, and we value opportunities like this to bring the serious issues that are facing not only our region, but our entire country. As the region's most impactful performing arts center, it is our role to play in bringing art as a tool to bringing people together. We invite you back to the Kimmel Center, whether it be a Broadway show, one of our mini jazz performances, hip hop, gospel, and yes, a little comedy. We believe that this place belongs to everyone in Philadelphia. And I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and especially WURD for their example they've set for Philadelphia for the impact both here and across the country. It really is an honor at this point to introduce my friend and someone I work with very closely, Sara Lomax-Reese. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So this is WURD's 15th anniversary, as many of you know, if you were at our Sankofa Awards ceremony. And I heard Ed's introduction, so I don't have to say who I am, clearly. But we're really excited about this collaboration, and it came together very organically. The Kimmel Center had been planning this conversation with DeRay Mckesson for a long time. And in a kind of a happenstance, my colleague, Monica Lewis, was talking with the Kimmel about the fact that, well, she was talking to them about a number of things in terms of working together, but she also mentioned that we were about to celebrate our 15th anniversary. And the spark went on, and they said, wow, why don't we combine these two events? And so we created this kind of hybrid event where it's WURD's 15th anniversary and this conversation with DeRay Mckesson. And we're really excited to get ready to get into an important conversation that I'm calling a meditation on freedom, because DeRay Mckesson's new book is called On the Other Side of Freedom, The Case for Hope. And so we have three amazing panelists who are going to be engaging in a very robust dialogue about these questions around freedom, particularly at this time in our history where we are seeing a lot of retrenchment when it comes to civil rights and freedom and all of those things. And so we're really excited to have that conversation. And we're also going to be talking about the freedom of the press, because WURD Radio is a part of the media. We are a part of the press. And a really critical fact is that only 2% of radio stations are Black owned and operated. Only 2% in the whole country. And so there's a real opportunity to explore what that means in this moment and how we strengthen and fortify independent Black media at this moment. So right now, I want to invite our panelists to come out so we can get into it. I want to invite Lorene Cary. And Lorene, she's coming. I'll give a little bit of background on Lorene and what I'm really excited about. Lorene Cary wrote this amazing book called The Price of a Child, which was the first One Book, One Philadelphia book club book. And it is really my all-time favorite book, but she's currently working on a play about Harriet Tubman and has written a mini opera as a resident of the American Lyric Theater's 2017-18 Composer and Librettist Development Program. She's also a professor at University of Penn. She just did this amazing program called Vote That John. So Lorene will be coming out in a minute. DeRay Mckesson is here, and this is definitely DeRay's, an opportunity for you to get to know DeRay. And I believe everyone who is here will get a copy of his book, On the Other Side of Freedom, with your ticket. So you will become more and more intimately connected with DeRay Mckesson by reading his book. But DeRay is a civil rights activist, community organizer, and the host of Crooked Media's podcast, Pod Save the People. And you may remember him as being really instrumental in the Ferguson protests. And so we're going to hear his story. And I've been reading On the Other Side of Freedom, and it is a very beautifully written, powerful story. And he's part of that new generation of activists. And also on the panel is Dr. Marc Lamont Hill. And yes, another local Philadelphian, and I hang out at his cafe all the time, Uncle Bobbie's in Germantown, and that's his newest foray. So he is, you see him on CNN, he's a professor at Temple, he's an entrepreneur, and he's just a mover and shaker in this city, and a very deep thinker, and does a lot of activism internationally as well as locally and nationally. So I think we're welcoming everyone to the stage. They got me out here like all on my own. I'm thinking the doors, okay, here we go. Thank you. Y'all aren't gonna leave me hanging out here.
Mark is coming. He's right there. He's coming.
Pulling up the rear. All right. Okay. So for me, and for some of you out here, this is part 2 of our event. For some of you out here, this is part 1. So I'm very excited to be moderating this discussion. So as I said in my remarks, I don't know if you heard him when you were coming in, but I really see this as a conversation, a meditation on freedom, the concept of freedom. And so I kind of want to level set for the panel, for the audience, so that we can agree on some terms. And so I want everyone to comment and start our conversation by giving your definition of freedom. And so I guess I'll just start with you, Mark, because you're right here, and you were a little bit late, and so you gotta, I'm gonna get you right on your toes.
Freedom. Y'all can hear me, right? First of all, good evening, everybody. I mean, it's not often I get to be on stage with such illustrious people, so I'm really, really grateful. I'm grateful to you for all the work you do and all that you've done and all the Lomax family has done and all the WURD has done in our community. DeRay, I get to sit next to you. Normally I only get to see you at fancy places in passing, so to be able to sit next to you and think about freedom and justice is pretty amazing. Of course, you know, you and I, Lorene, have hung out many times and since the Art Sanctuary days, and I'm grateful for all you've done in our community. So all of that shapes how I think about freedom. You see me stalling?
Well, let me help you out. So we're using.
No doubt.
This is what we're talking about.
I know. I read the book. I saw.
We
sell the book.
I know. I saw it in your store.
Yeah. I actually read it twice. No, I was thinking. So when I think about freedom, I think it's hard to think about freedom because freedom is always kind of our possibilities for freedom are always foreclosed upon by the immediacy of the moment. So when I think about what freedom is, I try to strip away all the statistics, all the bad news, all the evidence to the contrary, all the things that tell us what we can't do. And I try to meditate on what it would mean to recognize each person's fundamental humanity if we didn't have those kinds of limitations. Howard Thurman, a great theologian and mystic, said that we should never scale down our dreams to the level of our immediate experience. He said we should never be prisoner of the event. The event could be Ferguson. The event could be Trump. I know, that's a hell of an event.
That's a tsunami.
And it's a bad event, but we don't have to be prisoner to it. So when I think of freedom, I think of what would it mean to imagine this fully realized humanity, not against the backdrop of the urgency of Trump, and it's urgent. Not against the backdrop of Kavanaugh, that's urgent. But bigger than that. So in other words, I think about freedom as the most expansive dream of humanity, the most robust and ambitious dream of humanity that we could ever have. So instead of dreaming of warmer and fuzzier prisons, I want to dream of a world without prisons, right? Instead of dreaming about, because it's possible, right? I don't want to look on YouTube and see cops, dancing with our kids, making video. I mean, that's nice and it makes you feel good for 10 seconds. I want to live in a world where police aren't occupying our neighborhoods and where harm is addressed through restorative practice rather than punitive punishment. I want to live in a world where we don't need Me Too. I don't want an effective, respected Me Too movement. I want to live in a world without rape culture, right? So that's freedom. For me, that's freedom.
So, DeRay, because you've thought about this and wrote a book on it, I'm gonna come to you last, okay? Lorene, see, I switched it up. You were like, she's gonna go to DeRay next. So, a meditation on freedom, what does it mean to you? What is your definition?
Ever since I've been thinking about this for the last day or two, and I've been trying to understand it in terms that are not just American freedom, because that's where
you're electric.
Do I need to take things off or something? Because that's the way I learned it. I learned it in terms of America, which was about individualism and liberty and making money and individual rights. And I've been thinking about freedom in terms that have to do with our ability to, Marc's definition of living fully into our humanity is where I was going, but it has more of an our, more of an us than a me. Because anytime I start to think about it, it has to do with how I'm able to have children, raise children, educate them, have families. So all of the stuff about humanity, but in terms of us, family, community, all of our concentric circles, and the concentric circles going wider than tribe, going into a larger circle.
DeRay, on the other side of freedom, the case for hope, what is your kind of definition, if we level set, to start the conversation?
So I'll start by just saying thank you all for coming. You know, it has been, we've been in 22 cities on the book tour. This is in some ways the last stop, so I appreciate all of you being here. I will also shout out my sisters here today. My sister, I'll just say now her name is DeRay. We are not twins, we're just black from Baltimore with round names. But I love her. So it is good to see so many new faces, and then so many faces of people that I have known for a long time. Miss Bales, who I taught 6th grade, I taught alongside Miss Bales. She's here, my cousin. So it's great to see a lot of people. When I obviously have thought about it because I titled the book On the Other Side of Freedom, but when I think about freedom, it's this idea of not only the absence of oppression, but the presence of justice and joy. And so much of our work is focused on the absence of oppression. It's like tear down the jails, free people, like the end of police violence, knowing that like when we get everybody out of jail, that's not the presence of justice, right? That like we still have to build the affirmative. And I'm interested in like how do we make sure that this is like a both and not an either or when we think about the work. So like we have to get rid of the bad stuff, but like we are more than just pain. Black people are more than just the things we fight against. We also have to be the things we build. Like I'm interested in that as like how we talk about what freedom sort of looks like and feels like. The second is I'm also interested in the way that we use language to do all of this work. So we think about some of the easier things like equality and equity, that equality is the notion that everybody gets the same thing. Equity is that people get what they need and deserve. And the work of justice is almost always the work of equity. So we're never asking for equal funding in school systems, we're asking for equitable funding in school systems. Like, how do we use that language in a way that actually like helps us? You even think about things like accountability and justice, right? Accountability is what happens after the trauma. Justice is the fact that people should never have to experience the trauma in the first place. And like I think about that when I think about like what freedom I want it to feel like and sound like and be like when we're in community with each other. You know, I taught 6th grade math in East New York, Brooklyn. Me and Miss Bales taught alongside each other. And 6th grade is the best grade. 6th grade is great. 7th grade is rough. 7th grade is puberty and deodorant. And 7th grade always makes me wonder like why they made Axe spray. You're like, who made Axe spray? Bad. 7th grade is hard. But what I love the most about 6th graders is like the magic that they brought to the classroom. Like it was still like this magical place. And I taught 60, 90, and 120-minute classes, which is a very long, it's a lot of math. And one day my students were like, can we go to gym early? And I was like, you can absolutely go to gym early. Gym teacher's one of my best friends. Y'all can go, you tired of me, I'm tired of your gym. And so they go to gym, and then they come back, and they come back really early. And I'm like, why are you back so early? And what I realized is that they're in love with the idea of gym more than the work of gym. And I say that because in this moment, I think there are people more in love with the idea of resistance than the work of resistance. And when I thought about the book, it was this question of like, how do we talk about the work in ways that make sense? How do we talk about the work in ways that help people do something different in the world? So even the title On the Other Side of Freedom, I used to give this talk and it was like, we know so much about this side of freedom. We know that we arrest more people for weed than all violent crimes combined. We know that 1/3 of all the people killed by a stranger in this country is killed by a police officer. Like we know so much about this side of freedom. The question is like, how do we get to the other side and what that looks like? I'm excited too to be in this panel and conversation. This is the only stop on the tour that we've had like a couple people on stage. And the reason why we did it here as we end the tour is like, the only way, you know, the term social justice in some ways is redundant, that there is no justice that isn't social, right? Like justice is necessarily about how we're in community together, and we wanted to model that today. So I thank both of you, and I'm moderator,
Well, all right.
for being here.
Excellent. And it's also WURD's 15th anniversary, so we got to talk about freedom of the press. We got to talk about independent Black media. So I'm going to throw that one in, and it'll be relevant, don't worry. So I think that this panel represents kind of an intergenerational panel, and different experiences and tools that have been at our disposal to communicate. And so I want to talk about the role and the importance of Black media throughout history and in a contemporary context. And I'm going to start with you, Lorene, because You do a lot of research and study in kind of the 1800s and the early part of the Black struggle. A lot of times people think that the civil rights movement of the 60s is when our struggle began, but we know that that's not when it began. And so, I often use this quote that Frederick Douglass wrote in 1847 when he started the North Star newspaper. And he said, "We are now about to assume the management of the editorial department of a newspaper devoted to the cause of liberty, humanity, and progress. The position is one which, with the purest motives, we have long desired to occupy. It has long been our anxious wish to see in this slave-holding, slave-trading, and Negro-hating land a printing press and paper permanently established under the complete control and direction of the immediate victims of slavery and oppression." So I want to see if you could speak to the historic significance of the Black press and our quest for liberation and freedom.
Do a little meditation on it for sure. The minute you were talking before Frederick Douglass and the North Star, I was thinking about Gustavus Vasa writing his own autobiography, 100 some years earlier. I was thinking about all the different ways, whether it's, so there's press, starting a printing press and calling it the North Star, versus song, broadsides, petitions, all the ways that Black Americans expressed themselves publicly before they got a printing press. So I think the press comes out of that, and it comes out of that desire, and there's a generosity to it, to the press, that follows that way. There's a generosity to looking at the whole community. Some of the things that you were talking about, right? With looking at justice as a kind of a must-do other side. Where's the joy? Where's the freedom? I think the Black press has done that, whether it was, writing those autobiographies or Fred Douglass. Also, there's also been incredible bravery. I remember reading Ida B. Wells when I was in high school. I was a young woman who wrote, and to see what she did, Ida B. Wells gave me my first rules for writing and for figuring out, how do I tell these truths within the mainstream in a way that will be helpful to people who are being killed and hurt. In which a way so that I have my own integrity, where I use the white press, communicate with it, but am not co-opted by it. The move she had to do to tell the truth in a way that was helpful, not hurtful, to people who were being killed, but using white press so that nobody could undercut her and say, oh, these things aren't true. They're not true because I didn't say they were true. Does anybody hear an echo of that? Right? So she only used facts that were already published in the white press in order to prove things. So, just amazing. Just amazing. It has taken courage of individuals, but also groups. I also think back to the, looking at Wilmington, North Carolina, where some of you may have gone to see the film. There's a documentary shown at the African American Museum last night. I didn't get to it. But it was the only successful coup d'etat in the United States in history in 1898, maybe, somewhere around there. It was the only successful coup, and the reason they did the coup d'etat was the Black press there was so strong. They had talked so clearly about what was happening that they voted in a multiracial town council. And the white citizens went in and burned down the press, burned down the town council. And what the United States government did not do was go in and say, oh, hell no. The elected people, we're putting them back in. They didn't, so the coup was successful. So the Black press has also paid a price.
Mm-hmm. So Mark, I wanted to go to you because, you are a commentator on CNN. You do a lot of media. We're part of this 24-hour kind of media cycle now. And, it has created kind of this kind of feed the beast scenario where news is constantly breaking news. It could be, nothing, but it's always breaking news. So, I'm curious what you see, because you straddle a lot of different worlds in terms of this role of the media, and the Black media in particular, in advancing freedom. Because like what Lorene was saying in terms of like using the white press to make sure that our voice is heard, but it's also, we can use it strategically. And so I just am curious where you come down on it.
I think that's right, and I agree with everything Lorene said. I think there's also the question of not just how we make use of mainstream white press, which I think has been incredibly important, powerful, but also sort of how we produce our own stuff.
Yeah.
Right. The Black press begins first. Before there was a physical press, there was oral tradition, even within the African American slave context. Right. Songs, signs, symbols for freedom to get home, blankets, gospel songs, early Sunday school literature, radical, revolutionary stuff. This ain't Creflo. This is something else. This is freedom talk, right? Exodus is real. We trying to leave this place. That's our exodus. Ola Requiano, Gustavus Vasa. Absolutely. David Walker's Appeal.
Yeah, right.
Behind the Bible.
Oh, God, yes.
Right?
Right.
David Walker's Appeal. They in the church on Sunday, well, not a church, they in the fields behind the Bible. Because Negroes wouldn't allowed to have a book. They were banning it. Nat Turner's Rebellion happens right soon after David Walker's Appeal is published. Because David Walker was critiquing Christianity, and he was critiquing the slave enterprise. So the press, that's Black press. So at the same time that we were occupying these spaces, then you get to 1900s, W.E.B. Du Bois, Crisis Magazine, NAACP. I'm fast forwarding up and down. 1930s, The Final Call, which later became Muhammad Speaks and then became Final Call again. It was first called The Final Call to Islam. Then becomes Muhammad Speaks in the Malcolm era, and then becomes Final Call again in the 80s. Amsterdam News, Philadelphia Tribune, WHAT, WURD, DeRay. Because this is Black press too. The digital sphere. When DeRay is tweeting on the ground from Ferguson, that's an intervention into a conversation. And that was happening faster than a 24-hour cable news cycle. Because when we were in Ferguson, the cable news, I remember we got tear gas one night. Yeah, there was tear gas. And the crowd, I remember when we were tweeting, oh, we're getting tear gas. And then the news would be like, it's not tear gas. Those are false reports. It's smoke. When you get tear gas, you know you've been tear gas. No, you don't confuse tear gas with nothing else. No smoke, nothing, right? So we were able to counter-narrate the 24-hour cable news cycle. So DeRay can say, yo, they're saying the police are just standing there. No, the police are provoking. Oh, they're saying the crowds are provoking. No, the crowd's just standing there. Right? We were there. And so that intervention through our fingers, those Twitter fingers, to quote a great philosopher,
You can't take it nowhere.
became a mechanism to intervene in a conversation that otherwise excluded us. And then the beast you're talking about, 24-hour cable news, yeah, it's garbage. Except CNN, we recording.
We're recording.
CNN, y'all good. But that damn MSNBC and Fox, man. Because everything becomes urgent so that then nothing becomes urgent. We break news to say nothing is broken. And we become so obsessed with one story, which is Trump, that now dead Black people it's not good for business anymore. So we don't talk about the officer-involved shootings haven't dropped. Our coverage has dropped. So they tell us what matters. So part of what the black press is able to do is tell a different story about what matters. So that Trump tweeting something crazy, which happens every day, is important. But so is what's happening in Nigeria. So is what's happening in Tanzania. So is what's happening in South Africa. So is what's happening in Palestine. So is what's happening in Latin America. So is what's happening in East Asia. All of it's important, not just that Trump said something stupid. Black press has always told that story.
People ask me sometimes, why do you need a black talk radio station? Or what do you guys cover? And it's like, we cover everything everybody else covers, but with a different emphasis. We focus on the issues that speak to and are relevant to our people. Right. In the language and the experience and the culture that our people embrace and celebrate. So DeRay, I want to go to you because as Marc was saying, the social media revolution has really revolutionized media. And I wonder, as somebody who is in legacy media, is independent black media like radio and TV and those things, is it still relevant? Has social media and black Twitter kind of replaced the need? Is that now the new independent black media? And I want you to talk about, to Marc's point, what that immediacy means, the good and the bad, because there's some bad stuff that can happen with social media. There's some downside that can happen with social media. So why don't you speak to your experiences as kind of the young buck on the panel? Man. Marc, come on now. You know he's younger than you.
And Marc was with us for a bit of it, is that if you remember us marching in August, September, or October of 2014, we weren't marching because we thought marching was the best thing to do or the most effective tactic. It was illegal to stand still in St. Louis in those months. That if we stood still for more than 5 seconds, we were arrested. It was called the 5-second rule. We got it deemed unconstitutional in October, but for those first couple months, it was like that was why we marched all night. And the police thought that it was going to tire us out, that we were going to be so tired we were going to go home. And we were like, if we got to march, y'all got to march. And we did it all night long. And I think about when I sat in court as one of the plaintiffs in that court case, my piece of evidence was this tweet that I tweeted when these 4 officers walked up to me. They told me that I could no longer stand still, and the judge is like, sir, what is a tweet? And I'm like, I don't know how to explain it. But my tweet was the first recorded instance of the 5-second rule in St. Louis. And that was media, right? How do we use those platforms? I often think about, people talk about truth and reconciliation without wanting to acknowledge that the truth has to come before the reconciliation. And I think that what the media does that is so beautiful in some ways, is, especially when we are in charge, is it allows us to tell the truth in ways that people would otherwise ignore. I think about most of the news interviews that I did, especially in the beginning of the protest, I was always defending or explaining. So in Baltimore, if you remember that property damage that happened, I get on the news and they're like, DeRay, what's up with all those buildings? And I'm like, broken windows aren't the same thing as broken spines. Or one night in St. Louis, it was fist fights and it's not good. And the news just happened to be there that night. So they had all this footage of fighting. And I get on the news and they put the footage up and they say, DeRay, you told me that this was nonviolent. And I said, I don't know if we've ever talked about this, DeRay. I go, me and my sister fought all the time as kids and I never questioned my love for her. And the woman was like, okay. I was like, when you say something and you hope it lands, it landed. And she was like, I was like, whew, I was really digging deep on some of these things, but it was real. How do we just help people process this and give people language that is repeatable, that they can repeat in their dining room table? My bar is always, if I can't explain it to my aunt, then it doesn't matter. And not because my aunt isn't smart, but she's just not watching CNN all day. So how do I figure out an entrance and an on-ramp? And I think that what it means when we can control the media is we can think about entrances and on-ramps in different ways. I think that's a beautiful thing. When I think about Kavanaugh, besides today, what I used to say to some people, especially when I think about my aunt, I would say, they hide in the papers. She's like, they hide in the papers? I'm like, girl, they hide in the papers from us. And she's like, ooh. And then I'm like, and he don't believe in a woman's right to choose. And she's like, ooh, that's bad. I'm like, that is bad, right? how do we think of like a different interest? If I start some of these conversations about the police off with, we can live in a world without the police, for some people, that's just not a starter. I just can't start there with them. But I can start with the, do you think you need a gun to get a cat out of a tree? Do you think you need a gun to get the kids who didn't go to school today? Right? Like, how do we create these entrances for people in a way that makes sense? And I have seen like the beauty and the dark sides of social media. The first person ever permanently banned from Twitter was banned from raising money to try and get me killed. So I've seen that part of the platform. He now has White House press credentials, which is like frightening. And I've seen like the beautiful parts where like all these people, I think about all of us in St. Louis, like you know anything about the protest because of us. And you remember the first city that you ever saw aerial footage of was Baltimore, because in St. Louis there was a no-fly zone declared 3 days after the killing of Mike Brown. So like, if not for Twitter, you know, there was no Facebook video when we were out there was no Instagram live, no live, nothing. It was like Ustream, you know, it was like the old school streaming platforms, and then Twitter. Like we were using Vine. Like literally we would like take a video, we'd step back, we'd put it to our ear to try and find the best 6 seconds, and then we post it on the internet. Like that was what we did every night. So I've seen like that be powerful. So I don't think that the legacy platforms aren't important. I do think that social media has like allowed more people to enter into the conversation. What I worry about is like, I'm not convinced we're designed to get so much feedback. It's a lot of feedback to get all the time, and like that is not productive. And I find myself caught up in these like rumor mills, you know, like I look at some of the stuff people say about me, I'm like, I'm really not that bad. We might disagree, but like that was rough. And this is the thing about like, do you respond every time? Do you like, that's just different because things travel so quickly sometimes. So I'm hopeful though, you know, when I do think about the platforms and safety, it's like a lot of people came to the platform bad. The platform didn't make them bad, and that's not the platform's fault, right?
You know what, just to your point, I think it also encourages a certain two things. One, a certain kind of narcissistic culture that's part of the current moment where we're getting. You talked about social justice as not being detached from individual justice, and I think you're right. We have to think collectively, but sometimes if everybody's a star of their own show, if everybody has going live and has their own story all the time, it can kind of invite a certain kind of narcissism. And then the second thing is it invites a kind of culture of dragging, where we render each other disposable. Because like you said, it's not just that people criticize, it's that it's not really critique. It becomes like they don't like something you say, they don't like something I say. And then 50,000 people pile on. And then it doesn't become about the thing you said anymore. It becomes about you, even if they've never met you. And now they're invested in not liking you or invested in not liking this. And so we start throwing each other away. I watch on Twitter every week somebody who's maybe working for 50 years for us says something we don't like, and they're canceled. We throw them away, we dispose of them. And I think it creates a kind of bullying culture. I didn't mean to cut you, I guess I did mean to cut you off, but I want to, I think what you're saying is such an important thing, and I think this idea, I'm gonna drag this person, I'm gonna call this person out, it doesn't invite healing.
And I do think the larger point there is like, I don't think we figured out how to talk. A lot of people give lip service to accountability, and I don't think that we figured out like how to have tough conversations in movement work. Like I think it's just like we haven't figured it out. That like there are some people who do things and say things that like don't make sense, and we should say like, I understand, right? And then sometimes that becomes like an attack, and like that isn't productive because like, you know, we got a lot of work, and today was a great example of like, we still got a lot of work to do. So, you know, I'm mindful, I'm hopeful about it. I've seen so much good come from it though, you know, and like that's sort of the hard thing. But, you know, I remember we met with Sheryl Sandberg, who's the CEO of Facebook, and we said to her like, Sheryl, what are you guys doing about the Facebook accounts that are private and the Instagram accounts that are private that are white supremacists, because we know they exist. And she was like, DeRay, we're gonna have AI fix that. And it's like, well, AI is racist, so that's not helpful. And then like, when is that happening? You know, like when's AI coming? So I'm nervous, I get nervous about that. But again, like some people came to the platform bad, the platform didn't make them bad. I think the platforms have a responsibility to make sure that people don't like form groups of badness and radicalize. Like they need to figure that part out in a way that I think that they are slow to do.
Can I add one more
Sure,
thing about
please. This
the
is
other-
organic. You guys jump in.
I think the other thing about legacy, or places where you have longer to work and research, where you have people who are trained and all they do all day long is figure out how to tell the story. There are some stories that need that time, and you can't do investigative journalism of the sort that we need to complement sort of activist journalism. You can't do that for free. You can't do that on the side. So I think that's one of the things that the Black press has always figured out a way how to scramble with much less money to tell the stories we need and to find things out that other people weren't looking for. But you have to be able to eat in order to take the time to go through, 850 documents. And that's what legacy journalism can do well.
Yeah, I'll put you on the spot. I'll ask you, do you know why kids eat paint chips, ate lead paint chips? I'm obsessed with lead. If I wasn't working on the police and stuff, I'd work on lead all day long. I'm obsessed with it. Do you know why kids ate lead paint chips?
They're sweet.
Because it's sweet. Yeah. I didn't know this. Lead is naturally sweet, which I'm obsessed with. And what makes that so wild is that there was a period of time in the country where the housing administration mandated that all the paint in the projects be lead-based paint, which is insane. And you think about there was this narrative for so long that kids eating paint chips, their parents just didn't care about them, the kids were dumb, or that was a narrative. But it's what if the walls was candy? That is what it was for people. And what is even wilder is that there's no cure for lead. So the best that we can do is therapy. So you think about Flint. Flint has had the single biggest decrease in childhood literacy that we've ever recorded. It's a 75% decrease in childhood literacy, which is wild. That is wild. And when we think about this question in the media, it's who's asking the questions and to what end, right? And I think that when people of color who know what it's like to be marginalized, when they're in the room asking the question, you're that is just different. The outcome is different. And I'm fascinated by those things. On the pod, we covered this story about why young people aren't participating in absentee ballots. Do you know this? Why young people are less likely to send an absentee ballot? Because they don't know how to buy stamps. They've never bought a stamp before, which is
buy them online now.
You can buy them. Yeah, but literally that's the biggest barrier to young people, millennials, sending an absentee ballot back is they literally have never bought a stamp before. And you're that is wild. But you think about all these communities. So how do we make sure that people are in the right place to ask the right question? Or even there's this narrative that conservatives, people get more conservative when they get older. That's you've heard that before. But what the data actually suggests is that people who are on the left actually never get older. Poor people and people of color just die before they get to the age where we measure their political experience. And you're that is just different. And it's been interesting to have the podcast and be in a place where we can just be curious in a different way. And we learn this stuff. We're I never knew that,
So I want to get into some of the hot issues of the day. Today we had a major setback with Kavanaugh being confirmed. And so I want to talk a little bit about gender violence. And I'm going to start with you, Marc, because I found some quotes from you online.
I'm ready for this.
Yes. Some of your Twitter,
I was hacked.
Some of your Twitter rants.
I'm fine, NBC.
Yep.
Fine, NBC.
No, because we are in a really interesting moment. Locally, Bill Cosby was just sentenced, and around sexual violence issues, and Kavanaugh, and the protests, and Me Too, and so I believe this is one of your quotes, Marc. So the point here is that we have to move that default position that men are naturally innocent and women are naturally lying about sexual assault. And that's what we often do. We particularly do that when people have power and privilege. That is why we have to I have a missing word. That is why we have to
You're being dramatic.
Move away. Yes, I'm being dramatic. Okay. Yes. That is why we have to move away from this, especially in the Kavanaugh case.
Yeah.
And you also had a quote about Cosby, but I'll stop there.
Yeah. This is such an interesting moment, and it's filled with possibility, and I'm somewhat optimistic about it. And at the same time, it's hard to be optimistic about a world where sexual violence is still normalized, right? We talk about rape culture, and I think that's where we have to begin. We're talking about rape culture. We can't look at Bill Cosby or Kavanaugh as outliers, as exceptions. Rather, we have to look at the fact that we're in a world where women's bodies are always vulnerable to the male gaze, to the male touch, and further. catcalling, street harassment. We could start there. Because from the moment, I mean, I remember, I literally went home and cried last year. My daughter's 14, she was 13 at the time. And she was telling me about the way, she was walking to the store a block away, and she was just telling me about the way that she started to walk home, in the direction she would go. And she said, I started to walk away off the main street because men would keep beeping and saying things to me. She's 13, you know? And I wasn't like enraged, like in some kind of, I don't own her. You know, it wasn't like that. It was crying that she has to enter or live in a world, occupy a world where that becomes a normal part of how she strategizes life. Not at 13, really at 10, 11, 12. That's part of rape culture, right? A sense of entitlement over space. When somebody tells you to smile, and you might not want to smile. You might want to roll your eyes. That's okay. It's your body. But we live in a world where we feel like we have to have complete control over women's bodies at all times. So then when you get to the actual conversation about rape and sexual assault more broadly, this logic continues to prevail. Our default position is, what did she do? What was she wearing? How much did she drink? Was she clear enough when she said no? Did she say no more than once? Et cetera, et cetera. So our default position is to assume that she did something to do this. Well, if you hadn't drank so much, this wouldn't have happened. No, if he hadn't assaulted me, I wouldn't have got assaulted. Right? I could be able to drink a fifth and be fine. I should be able to go to someone's house at 3 a.m. and be fine. If I don't consent, that should be the end of it. But we don't have that logic. Think about how we talk. You could be watching a PG movie and someone will make a joke about dropping the soap in jail. We normalize rape. So this becomes part of the conversation. And then that attached to this idea of not just disposability of female bodies, but also the kind of need to protect male power, and particularly privileged male, white males, wealthy males, becomes a whole other thing. Because part of the Bill Cosby thing that's fascinating to me is people are outraged, people are outraged that Bill Cosby wasn't afforded. Let me put it differently. People keep saying, well, so-and-so did it. Donald Trump's assaulted lots of folk. That's an argument for holding Trump accountable, not for not holding a Cosby accountable. We're fighting so that black men can have the same unfettered power and control over women that white men do. We're fighting to be as violent as somebody else. And I'm not suggesting that white men are disproportionately or naturally more violent than black men. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying in terms of what we have, how we socially construct permission, right? And entitlement and stuff like that. So for me, when I look at Kavanaugh, when I look at Cosby, when I look at all this stuff, I just keep thinking, wow, we're at a moment where we're having more conversations about accountability. But Kavanaugh still, right? I mean, that's the point, right? And it's, we can't ruin a whole man's life for what he did when he was younger. Like you're just entitled to be on the Supreme Court. Like his life's not even ruined. Like, I only got to be a federal court judge. You in your 50s, you rich, you went to Yale twice. You all right. But part of the unmitigated gall of whiteness is I need access to everything. So if I can say anything, but if I can't say the N-word, oh my God, I'm under attack. I should be able to assault people allegedly and get to the Supreme Court. And if I can't get to the Supreme Court, something's wrong with America. We got to make it great again. There's a way that power is concentrated in ways that continue to dehumanize, erase, and dispose of black girls, black women, black femmes, and we have to reimagine that. And these cases to me are a reminder of why and how.
All right. So I want to go to you. Yes. He was breaking it down. I'm going to ask, so we got some questions from the audience. Wonderful. We're going to get to those in just a minute. But I'm going to ask DeRay and Lorene another hot topic question. DeRay, I'm going to go to you because a lot of what you talk about in your book, On the Other Side of Freedom, is about criminal justice reform and police brutality. And you talk about this, I want you to talk about your mapping police violence project, because you're using data and information to really analyze and prove police misconduct and police brutality, and how we can use that information, that data, to really change laws. You go into a lot of detail about police unions and how they really, continue institutionalized oppression and injustice. And so talk a little bit about the work that you've done and the work that you continue to do around criminal justice issues and police brutality.
Even when I think about this issue of gender violence, it's like what was interesting about the polling with Kavanaugh is that some of the headlines would be like America's torn. It really was white women who were torn. Like, what black people were like, decidedly he's wrong. It was this like question of like, what is going on with who's organizing white women, which I think is like an open question at this moment, because like the polling, they like really support him, and you're like, this is really special. So that made me think of that with the data. But with the police, it was like, we saw, Mike Brown's name. The police killed 9 people in St. Louis right after Mike Brown while we were still in the streets. So it was like, St. Louis has the highest rate of police violence in the country. We found that out in the data. But if you've heard of any number about police violence at all, it came from the aggregate of newspaper reports. If you get killed in this country and the newspaper doesn't write about it, then you're not in the data set, which is really wild. So the data set you probably know the best is the Washington Post. It's like the most famous data set, or the most sort of publicly known. The challenge with the Washington Post data set is that it only includes on-duty killings that include a gun. So Eric Garner's not in the database. The officers were on duty, wasn't a gun. Botham Jean, who was just killed by the officer who just like walked into his apartment, off duty and included a gun, not in the database, right? So we created one database that just has all of it. We think that if an officer goes home and shoots his wife in the head, that should be counted somewhere. We think if an officer like runs over somebody while they're chasing somebody else, we think that is an instance of police violence. So that was like a big part of the work. What was interesting, we found a lot of interesting things, one of which was that it looked like there's some towns in Texas where white people were being killed disproportionately more than people of color. And what was happening is that because it was just newspaper reports and no official data, Latinos were being miscoded as white. So a lot of the code, we just had to like go back and figure out people's demographic data better. So that was really interesting. We found things too, like there's no correlation between community violence and police violence. So people would say like, well, the neighborhood's dangerous, so the police are always there. And because the police are always there, then like, it's just likely that they engage in violence. And like that actually isn't true, so that was interesting. But the most fascinating stuff that we did is that we did the first ever database on police union contracts and police use of force policies in the country. And we found things like in California, there's a law that says that any investigation of an officer that lasts more than a year can never result in discipline regardless of the outcome. Like, that doesn't make sense. In Cleveland, they destroy police officer disciplinary records every 2 years. In Maryland, there's a law. In Maryland, the law says that you can file an anonymous complaint against an officer for everything except brutality. And we're like, well, we are no longer shocked, right? Like, we're like, we get it. Like, this is why nobody's ever held accountable. And that was like part of the learning, was that like we used to be like, oh, it's the bad prosecutor, the grand jury. And then it's like the rules are actually so hijacked that like, that's why it makes sense that 97% of the people are never charged and 99 are never convicted, because the rules almost don't allow. We work with the Austin protesters. In Austin, the city council voted against the police union contract unanimously. First time that's ever happened. It was incredible. In Austin, they recode 1, 2, or 3 day suspensions get recoded in the officer's file as a written reprimand. We're like, this is wild. Like, who even thought of these things? So like, that was like a fascinating thing to go through. We also challenged some of the more public things that you think are good. So people talk about training and like, we're pro-training, sign us up for training. Training is good. But I don't know what a training module looks like not to kill a 10-year-old. I just don't know what that training looks like. Like, I don't know how long you got to sit in a session not to shoot a 10-year-old. Like, that seems like something else. Or this this idea that like, you know, we need to have community policing with this idea that the police should just like be embedded in community. It's like, you shouldn't have to like high five my kid every day to treat him like a normal person, right? Like you shouldn't have to play basketball with my cousin to like not harm him. So like, how do we not feed into that stuff? And even like the unconscious bias trainings, it's like, we sort of believe in unconscious bias, but some of this bias seems really conscious, right? That like, the Starbucks stuff, it's like, that seemed pretty conscious that she was like, you know, two black men, like that's conscious, right? So how do we not let people off the hook with some of this stuff is like also part of the work. But what we realize is that like it's structural, that like some of the stuff that's happening in public is just like, yes, we can talk about, you know, the bad prosecutor and those sort of things, and those are real, but unless the structure changes, then it won't matter. And like that was one of our big learnings. I write about it in chapter 3, this chapter called The Problem of the Police, that just like helps people think about like what are the structural things. In Chicago, where Van Dyke was just convicted, which is good. In Chicago, the law said, or the contract says that they destroy police officer disciplinary records every 5 years, right? And you're like, that just doesn't make sense. So that was a lot of our learning, trying to use the data to tell a more complete story. When we think about gender violence, the reason that we talk about men so much when we think about police violence is because people are focused primarily right now on police violence that results in death. The next part of the work has to be thinking about police violence that is more expansive, that is not only death. And that is where we think about gender more deeply, that like when it's violence that results in death, it's like 95% men. That is just what the data is. When you think about sexual assault, it's completely different, right? So how do we, the problem for us, people interested in data, is that like there's no data that we can get our hands on. So in Baltimore City, all that data is on like, it's on paper. Like it's not in a computer anywhere, so it's just like hard to get the data sets. And then with the gender stuff, we are really interested in like all the connections that you don't think about. So if you know about Obama phones, which are, we shouldn't call them Obama phones, but we do. But from the FCC, like phones that people who are low income or who qualify for government assistance, they can get the phones. This FCC is about to cut back on the phones. And what's interesting about that in a really scary way is that we think that that's going to lead to a spike in domestic violence. And the reason is that a lot of the domestic abuse shelters rely on the phone programs, because what abusers do is that they will work really hard to ruin a woman's credit so they just can't open accounts in their own name. So they can never get a phone that they can control themselves. And the Obama phones have actually been a way to like circumvent the abuser to just make sure a woman just has a phone. And in this country, any device, whether it has a plan or not, has to be able to call 911. And some of those phones too have just been recycled even when the plan goes away, just so women can dial 911. And it's those sort of things that we're trying to like just peel back the layers. Like how do we help people see that like you wouldn't naturally see? Or even we're doing a project now on emails in prison. So if you've ever emailed somebody who's incarcerated, so every time I email this one person that I'm emailing, I have to buy an electronic stamp. The number of stamps that I buy is predicated on how long the email is, and I can only buy stamps in books. You're like, this is the biggest scam there is, right? And how do we help people? Like, you don't see that on the news, but that's happening, and we spend a lot of our time trying to figure out, like, how do we teach you the things that you don't know that we believe that if you knew will radicalize you?
Wow. I love it.
So we have a major election coming up on November 6th, and I'm going to ask you, Lorene, because you've been really engaged around voter engagement, is particularly for younger people. You just had a big event called Vote That John that was really trying to focus on younger people and getting them civically activated. And so, you know when we look at the national landscape, there's a very different reality locally and at the state level, particularly for Black people. You know, locally, Philly is about 45% African American. There are things that we can control and execute on in some respect from a voter engagement standpoint. When we look nationally, we're 12-13% of the national demographic. But I want to see if you could talk a little bit about civic responsibility, voter engagement, to talk about what we, with November 6th, like right around the corner, what we as a community seeking freedom need to be looking at, and the work that you're doing around Vote That John.
I will try, but I'll tell you the truth is, the reason I write long books is because I like to sit in a room and think about stuff for 2 or 3 years, which makes these kind of panels really hard for me. It's really hard to just jump on that, because part of what I've got here in my mind is the connection, the structures. I keep thinking about how Jan Carew is this wonderful Jamaican scholar who talked about total war, that total war was being fought on African American people through violence, through legal structures, and through cultural depictions. And we've been talking about that kind of stuff. But I'm also I'm thinking also though about the parallels, the moments in history where white women's rights and African American rights were looked at as two separate things, when in fact, both of them were going at the same time, were being challenged at the same time, because both of them are challenging white male supremacy. And we're at that exact moment, with the Chicago police officer, all that happening at exactly the same time. And when you're talking about getting all those extraordinary statistics, and you're talking about what happens with, not only in our cultural life, but in your own personal life with your daughter, which makes it all the way live, right? What we're seeing is, what are the structures that we have created as human beings that we can uncreate if we can be smart enough and have enough goodwill. But what are the structures that make it so? What are the rules that make it impossible to behave well and make it so easy to behave poorly to each other? And it is on a continuum with using rape as a weapon of war. It's on a continuum. The fact that there are catcalls, the fact that at 16, somebody locked me in the freezer at the little diner where I worked. All of these are on a continuum that says this is okay. You can do this. Part of this business of doing peer-to-peer voter support, and I'm just going to call it that, really, because we just started in the spring. We had a group of kids over the summer who were the Summer Youth Steering Committee who decided. Part of the deal was to do a little bit like Reverend Brown talked about from Boston, about the Boston Miracle. He said, yeah, I can walk around with clergy at night and talk to people and bring down crime in my area because I'm actually doing helpful things to young people, for young people at night. But I can't make it cool. I can't make it, he said, I can't make it hot. I can't make people want to be part of this who are young. So part of doing the peer-to-peer is saying to young people, I can talk about this, but I can't make it delightful. I can't make it fun. I can't make it happy. So how do you come up with all the cultural affect by young people, for young people, to say, come on, let's do this. How are we going to do this? That is not only, this is your point about the other side of freedom, that is not only about anger or protest or the things that are male-like, that make you look big and strong, like you're going to F somebody up, like that, like, yeah, let's get on that. But in fact, how to get cultural affect that we usually only associate with commercial ventures, with stuff that's expensive, with stuff that has name. How do you do that for yourself, for your own self? How do we do that? How do we make the songs, make the videos? How do we share the information? So that's been our project, really, and we're working on. But it means a constant work to get young people, to get adults doing things with and for young people. When older people have all of their own agenda, and I think that's part of the point. Yeah, vote that John. We got a really great video, and the song is wonderful. Hashtag vote that John.
So So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and so I'll throw this one out. What are the lessons, concepts, or vocabulary most important for students and young adults to learn to build equity and lead for change? And DeRay, I guess you're going to take this one because this is a two-parter. And DeRay, how many vests do you own?
I write about the vest in the book, so we can, just one. So I wear one vest every day. I've been wearing this vest since the protest. It's like my tattoo. It keeps me grounded in I'm in enough rooms now that I never want to forget that what we went through is real. It reminds me of how fragile freedom is. I have a lot of vests now because people give them to me as gifts because they think I love vests. So I have a whole set of vests that just are in the house. When I think of my advice to teachers is remember that young people often have the experiences before they have the language, and that we shouldn't penalize them for not having the language. So if I walk into a sixth grade classroom and say, talk to me about racism, they might be like, I don't know. But if I say have you ever been followed? Do you think anybody ever treated you differently? That is me honoring the fact that they've had an experience, and they might not have the language right now to talk about it in the way that I'm used to hearing it, but that doesn't render the experience invaluable. And then to young people, it's remember to follow your curiosity and ask the question. It's one of the, I was the chief human capital in the school system in Baltimore, the youngest chief in the history of the district. And what was interesting about it is that chiefs are that's people's career goal. And I get it. I was I'm going to be here for a year. I've got other things to do. I'm excited to be back. Is that when people get to those positions, one of the things I saw so clearly is that people just lost their curiosity. That was they made it, they got there, and no longer do they have that sense of wonder. And it's never lose that sense of wonder. I think that what we did that was so special in 2014 was we walked into the risk. We said, we don't know many things, but we know one thing well, that Mike Brown should be alive today. And we can carry that truth with us into every single room we have. And it was just that simple. So that is some of my advice. And then to older people who still understand themselves to be students, it is remember to share the cognitive work with people. That so often in this work, when we're morally right, we preach and we do a whole lot of preaching. And the challenge with that is that we want to put people in a place where they have to do some work. So I think about when I talk about social welfare programs now, I'm no longer preaching about the virtue of social welfare programs. I'm saying tell me what a 4-year-old has to do to earn dinner. What does a 7-year-old have to do to deserve shelter? You tell me, right? Or I was on a panel once with a police officer, and she said to me, DeRay, there's a lot of crime, da-da-da. Are you saying the police should never kill somebody? And I said, tell me when the police should kill your child. She was I don't know. I'm well, I don't know either, right? If you don't know, I don't know. But it's how do we share the cognitive work with people so that we're not only preaching? And I will just say very quickly, is that when people say preach to the choir, I'm actually obsessed with the idea of the choir, that I want to build the biggest choir. I want to figure out how do we build the biggest group of people singing the same song, going to the same rehearsals. And any of you who've ever been in a church choir or been around a church choir, you know that being in the choir is a whole lot of work, right? Nothing is passive about being in the choir. The choir is hard, right? And we want to find those people who don't believe that they can sing yet, but we know they can. We want to find the people who are mumbling and turn it into a melody. The hummers turn it into a hymn. We want to find those people. That I think is our work. And I'm obsessed with the biggest choir. How do we build the biggest choir?
So we're going to take another question, and we're going to have to wrap things up. So we're going to keep these answers short. Malcolm X critiqued Black people's reality concerning Black people being the only people who have entertainers and athletes propped up as leaders. In the age of Kaepernick and Beyonce, who should be the leaders of today? And anybody who wants to take that?
I'm never going to say Beyonce should not do anything. I don't want them kind of problems. But I would challenge the premise of the question, which suggests that we should have a leader.
Well, it was leaders, plural.
Okay, or leaders. I think the very idea of leader still reflects a certain kind of power dynamic. And I respect the question. I think it's a good question. I guess I want to move away from anybody being our leader. I think about the role that Harry Belafonte played. Damn.
Stomach?
Yeah, he's snoring. This is my best stuff too, man. He lowered my self-esteem.
It's all right.
It's all good.
You're good, man. You're doing a great job.
I love Black people so much, man. I do. I love y'all so much. I think, first of all, I think our conception of leader, even beyond the question, is one that should be expanded, right? So that we think of a leaderful movement. We see that in Occupy. We saw that in Ferguson. We see this in other places where there's not a singular person, because that singular person tended to come out of the church tradition. Always was a man. Always was cisgendered. Always was straight. All these things, right, that limited the possibilities of leadership. And so the fact that black women played a central role in every freedom struggle we've ever had gets erased. The fact that same gender-loving men played a role in every, queer men, trans folk, played a role in every single resistance effort we've ever had gets erased. So part of it for me is just reimagining what leadership looks like from space to space, place to place. And then asking, what role can people with wealth and influence play in our movements? And that's where I go back to Harry Belafonte or Sidney Poitier. People who had political consciousness and who invested their money in ways that supported the movement. You don't have a March on Washington without Harry. And you don't have a Harry without Paul Robeson. So there's a long tradition of black folk in these spaces who can do interesting work, and they don't have to be considered the face of the movement or the leader of the movement. So I don't need Beyonce to be the leader of the movement, and Beyonce doesn't want to be the leader of the movement. What you see Beyonce do, though, both publicly and privately, is invest in Jay-Z and a whole bunch of other folk. Invest. I also need them to speak the truth, especially when it's difficult.
Thank you.
So when I see Colin Kaepernick pay an ultimate price, professionally, that's what I need my celebrities to do. I need you to want to be on the right side of history and the other side of freedom. More than you want to be rich and famous. So the question is, if you love black people, and if you love freedom and justice, what are you willing to lose? What are you willing to sacrifice? To tell the truth in public, to invest in your people, to invest in love, to stay and to speak out for the vulnerable, right? So I want Colin Kaepernick to speak out against police violence. We need black men to speak out against violence against trans women. We need to not erase people who are incarcerated. We have to be able to protect the vulnerable. And so that's what I want the rich and the famous to do. And I need them to show up. When we were in Ferguson, I wasn't there as much as you are. I was there August, I was back there again in November for most of those 2 months. I called up a whole bunch of celebrities. Some of them couldn't make it, they were out of town, cool. Some of them were like, I ain't going in front of them cameras because it will hurt my brand. These were prominent celebrities. I'm sure you know some too. Whole bunch of, I could say some names, your favorite celebrity probably is trash when it comes to this. But J. Cole was there.
Early. J. Cole was there early.
That's what I'm saying. And it was obvious that he was committed. Kweli was there. I mean, I could go and name a whole bunch of folk who were there. Jesse Williams was there. And they didn't make a spectacle out of being there. They were there because they loved us. I need them to love us enough to do that. I know you said keep it short, I apologize. But yes.
I'm going to just ask each of our panelists one more question because we're up against the clock. Because again, I want to end on a high note. What is the case for hope? What is the case for hope? DeRay's going to be the last person who speaks. So Marc or Lorene, it's a toss-up. Who wants to start? What is the case for hope?
Case for hope is every new child is born. For me as a mother, the case for hope is that I know that life exists and that for years and years people have been figuring out how to use whatever bit of freedom they have to make love, to find love, to share love. We do that, people do that constantly. That gives me hope.
Marc, case for hope.
Case for hope is that black people are still here.
Whoa!
My man right here. Sleeping dudes, you need to learn from this dude. There we go.
Tyrone is at every word event. So Tyrone, happy to see you, bruh.
I love it. But Tyrone loves black people.
Yes, he does.
And the case for hope, real quick, is that despite everything that has ever, but they did not know who they put on those ships. They had no idea. Slaves weren't brought to America, people were. Healers, mothers, fathers, mystics, magicians. And they came to this strange place and became the conscience of this place. They tried to kill you with food and you lived anyway. They took away the meat, you made greens. They took away the greens, you made pot liquor. You did whatever you had to do to survive. And at every moment, we have taught America what is possible. We have been more mature, more loving, more committed, more just to America than America could ever deserve. And so despite a nation trying to kill you, spiritually, culturally, socially, financially, we are still standing. We are still thriving. We are still winning. And so, no, I have never been more hopeful. I have never been more committed. I have never been more certain at this moment than at this moment, at this time, in this place, that we will claim victory, that we will be free, and that every single person will be on the other side of freedom.
We're going to have Marc on every side.
All right. Okay, DeRay. You get the final word.
Marc is going to do the video for the book now. He's going to have the audio version of The Case for Hope. Before I talk about that, very quickly, back to the celebrity thing real quick, is that one of the things that's interesting is that a lot of people are just trying to figure out what to do. They just don't know. And in Florida, there are 2 million ex-felons in Florida that can't vote. 1 in 5 black people in Florida can't vote, which is wild. And we saw that there were concerts coming up, and I texted Lady Gaga, I texted Katy Perry, got in touch with Jay-Z's team, and their concerts were going to be there. And we were like, will you just open up the venue and let the people getting signatures for the petitions, will you let them get signatures at the concerts? And they did. And it was huge because in one fell swoop, they got thousands of signatures in ways that they would have never done at a grocery store. And it's those, so when I think about the Beyoncés of the world, we're trying to get them to think about what is something different that you can do that actually makes an impact, right? Gaga's like, DeRay, can I go to the table? I'm like, Gaga, it's your concert, do whatever you want. She did at another event, she had people bring tampons to the venue, and then she gave them to the prisons and jails. She got 50,000 tampons at every single concert stop. And it's those sort of things that are a different way to think about what influence looks like, that is not just money, that if money could fix all this, we would have fixed it by now. Some of it is the strategy piece. And then when I think about hope as a belief that our tomorrows can be better than our todays. And when we say the system is broken and people say, oh no, it was designed to be like that, my takeaway is that it was designed, right? That people made this up, and because people made it up, we can make something different. And that is God didn't make Earth Man and white supremacy, right? I don't believe that. People made this up, and because people made it up, I have this everlasting belief that we can make something better. I appreciate all of you. I appreciate y'all. Thank y'all.
Thank you all. So, yes. So, are you going to go out and, okay, so, I just want to thank the panel and the Kimmel, because again, this was a hybrid event. For the WURD 15th anniversary party, the party continues. It doesn't end here. We actually have an after party with a DJ and some drinks and food and stuff right on the other side of this stage. So if you are here for the WURD 15 festivities, you can stay seated and then let people leave, and then you can proceed back there where you may have been earlier. DeRay is going to go out front and take photos, and all the books are already signed, so he's not signing books, but everyone here should have received a book On the Other Side of Freedom, The Case for Hope, and hopefully you will all read it because it is very well written. You are a very good writer. You didn't get them yet. If you're right, you'll get your gift bag with your book in it if you're with WURD on your way out. But anyway, thank you all so much for coming. I hope some of you will stick around. We got a great DJ. What's that? Oh, thank you, panelists. My sister's directing me from the wings. Thank the panelists. Thank you, Marc, DeRay, and Lorene. And thank you all for coming.
I'll give you my number. I'll give it to you backstage.
Oh, photo.